Here in this final part of Unit 3, Part 4 of Unit 3, we're going to complete our discussion of the anatomy and physiology of the digestive system by first focusing on the large intestine, which extends from the distal part of the small intestine at the ileocecal valve through to the anus. It's a much smaller, much shorter portion of the gastrointestinal tract. It's only 5 feet long, but it has a larger diameter than the small intestine. And the large intestine does carry some inherent functions. Water, which of course is absorbed throughout the gastrointestinal system, stomach, small intestine, can also be absorbed into the cardiovascular system from the large intestine. And the large intestine is also responsible for eliminating indigestible food. These are components of the food that we consume that were not absorbed as feces. In order, the subdivisions of the large intestine include the cecum, the appendix, the colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. We'll start with the cecum, which is the first part distal to the ileocecal valve. An extension of this first part of the large intestine is the vermiform appendix. It's basically a mass of lymphoid tissue that plays a role in immunity. The problem with the vermiform appendix, and we'll take a look at a picture of it shortly, is that it is prone to bacterial accumulation. And that's problematic in the event that this part of the digestive system becomes pinched and inflamed in what we refer to as appendicitis. So that's the inflammation of the appendix. An intestinal blockage can result in appendicitis, and that blockage will trap harmful bacteria in the appendix. And in this case, if that blockage will begin to start to squeeze off venous drainage, it will cause swelling, which will lead to a reduction in blood flow, which is ischemia, and eventually death of the tissue of that portion of the large intestine, which is what we call necrosis. And the problem with that is that there is a very high risk of appendicitis rupture. And in that case, feces will spill into the abdominal cavity, and that will create a very dangerous and potentially fatal bacterial infection. Prior to rupture, the treatment for this is basically surgical removal of the appendix. And this is an interesting study published in 2012. It was a retrospective observational type of study, but in this study 257 patients which were suspected of having a bacterial infection, which we'll discuss on the next slide in a little bit more detail, C. difficile, were admitted for C. difficile testing and also completed questionnaires. The results of this study were quite interesting in that of the 257 patients, 136 tested positive for this bacterial infection. Of these 136, about 20% had, of these 136, had previous appendectomies. Of the 121 patients that tested negative for the bacterial infection, 31.4% had previous appendectomies. And so a larger number of patients a larger percentage of the patients who had previous appendectomies tested negative for the bacterial infection. And although this is not a cause and effect type of study, it does raise an interesting question as to whether the appendix can serve as a potentially harmful bacterial reservoir that may predispose somebody for a C. difficile infection. Although the study doesn't make that cause and effect realized here, it does raise a rather interesting question. In terms of C. difficile, C. difficile, and as illustrated here in this colored electron micrograph, is a bacterium that can cause a great deal of distress for people so inflicted. It can lead, in very extreme cases, to life-threatening inflammation of the colon because the bacteria, in this case, does produce toxins that leads to an inflammatory response by the body. Particularly susceptible are older adults, other individuals that are immunocompromised as well. So transmission of C. difficile is common in hospitals and long-term care facilities through person-to-person transmission. So healthcare workers are often vectors for transmission of this bacteria from patient to patient. As a typical treatment for bacterial infections, antibiotics has often been the treatment of choice. However, the problem with prescribing antibiotics for C. difficile, it actually increases the chance of developing a C. difficile infection and increasing the severity of the symptoms because this particular bacterium is resistant to the antibiotic medication effects, and the antibiotics will also function to decrease the natural bacteria that exists within our large intestine. So a very effective treatment for C. difficile infections is actually a fecal transplant, where the feces of a healthy person is transplanted into the large intestine of an infected patient, because that repopulates the natural bacteria that exists that would eventually contribute to a reduction in the C. difficile bacteria. So this is a treatment that has been shown to be extremely effective in terms of addressing C. difficile infections. So moving back to the anatomy and structure of the large intestine, this illustration will outline the different components that we'll discuss here. So as we mentioned, the ileum is the distal part of the small intestine, illustrated right here, and it's separated from the proximal part, the first part of the large intestine, by a thickening of the muscular layer of this smooth muscle referred to as the ileocecal valve. And when this valve is constricted, it will prevent the emptying of the small intestine into the large intestine. So the cecum, as mentioned, is the first part of the large intestine, and we see branching off the cecum is the mass of lymphoid tissue referred to as the vermiform appendix. Ascending in a superior manner is what is referred to as the ascending colon. The ascending colon then will then move from the right side of the body to the left side of the body, now referred to as the transverse colon. You'll notice these small round-like patches, and these patches are referred to as haustra. A singular term is the haustrum, and these are small these are small bunches of the large intestine that are shaped because of the smooth muscle layer of the large intestine. Extending from the transverse colon is the descending colon, which then migrates through an S-shaped sigmoid colon, eventually becoming the rectum and the anal canal. And what we see there at the anal canal is a ring of skeletal muscle. So we have smooth muscle making up the large intestine, but until we get to the anal canal, the external layer is a ring of skeletal muscle, and being skeletal muscle, which forms the external anal sphincter, it is under voluntary control. Another component of the large intestine are the tennae coli. These are strips of longitudinal smooth muscle that when this longitudinal smooth muscle contracts, it will have the effect of generating peristalsis. So it will move chyme in a forward manner throughout the large intestine. If we take a look at an expanded view of the distal part of the large intestine, we see rectal valves, which are thickenings of the smooth muscle layer, which regulates movement of chyme and what at this point is now referred to as feces into the rectum. We see what are referred to as hemorrhoidal veins at the cross section. These are very superficial veins that drains the layers of the tissue of the rectum. And these being very superficial veins, they're very small and prone to rupture. The extending from the rectum is the anal canal, and we see two layers of muscle here. Here we see the internal anal sphincter that will be triggered to relax once feces are now present in the anal canal. But the external anal sphincter, which is external to the internal anal sphincter, is that ring of skeletal muscle that we saw on the previous diagram that is under voluntary control. In terms of defecation, this is the process in which the body empties the large intestine and is largely generated by a reflex. And this is initiated by stretching of the rectal wall. So the presence of feces in the rectum will stretch the rectal wall. The sensory receptors within the rectal wall will discharge receptors that will trigger the defecation reflex through the parasympathetic nervous system. So these sensory receptors will work through the spinal cord and will trigger contraction of the smooth muscle of the sigmoid colon and the rectum, and will generate a relaxation of the anal sphincters, which will empty this distal portion of the large intestine. Feces is composed of mostly of the food that we have not been able to digest and absorb. But there are other components within feces. Of that undigested food includes what's simply referred to as food roughage. This is dietary fiber. It is a carbohydrate that humans do not have the capacity for breaking down. Undigested protein, fat, other inorganic matter, as well as dead bacteria. We have a very extensive bacterial colony in our large intestine, and that can be detected in feces. And it is composed of 3/4 water. This is these are very general estimates, and these numbers do vary depending upon a person's health status, diet, and actually stress level as well. So we'll take a look at some rather common conditions afflicting the large intestine. And the first here is constipation, which refers to the slow movement of feces through the large intestine. And this results in large quantities of hard, dry feces because water is being absorbed from the digestive system, from the large intestine, into the cardiovascular system. Intestinal obstructions can result in constipation symptoms, so it's very important to understand how long a person has been experiencing these symptoms, and then determining what the cause of those symptoms are. Another potential cause of the symptom is an inhibition of the natural defecation reflexes that was addressed on the previous slide, and a possible cause of this is the overuse of laxatives. And so laxatives are an over-the-counter type of medication that people can take to address constipation. However, overuse does run the risk of suppressing the natural defecation reflex. And so if the natural reflex is suppressed, then that can result in these symptoms. So in terms of food intake, not enough fiber or liquid can have an effect, can increase the likelihood of constipation symptoms. A diet that it has too much of a fat content can also contribute to these symptoms. And research suggests that not enough exercise or physical activity can also lead to possible constipation. The opposite of constipation is diarrhea, which is essentially the frequent movement of watery feces. And there are quite a number of different factors that can contribute to diarrhea, so there isn't just one cause here. So what a person consumes can generate this diarrhea here. Any irritation of the mucosal cells will result in water secretion into the digestive system. Bacterial or viral infections can cause this. Certain medications, so a side effect of certain medications, can produce diarrhea symptoms. Cholera is a bacterial infection that afflicts certain countries. We don't typically see this in Canada or the United States, but it's potentially a life-threatening situation in which this bacteria can cause an excessive loss of water and charged elements, electrolytes, and is a particular problem in certain countries around the world. Another type of diarrhea is referred to as psychogenic diarrhea, and this can be caused by psychological stress. And so if we think about how psychological stress can cause this, remember, psychological stress can trigger excessive stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system. And because the parasympathetic nervous system controls digestive function, it's not uncommon that diarrhea signs and symptoms can result. Simple diarrhea is one in which the contents of the fecal matter are considered normal, with the exception of excessive water. A more serious type of diarrhea is what's referred to as membranous diarrhea, in which the fecal components include a higher than the normal amount of intestinal mucosal cells, and this is the inner membrane of the intestines. The intestinal cells of the digestive system are rapidly turnover cells. They do turn over quite rapidly, and so mucosal cells are expected to exist in normal, healthy feces. However, if that quantity is beyond what is considered to be within healthy, normal limits, it does suggest that there may be a serious gastrointestinal infection at play. Traveler's diarrhea can occur when a person travels to some destination that they haven't been to before. It can result from eating unaccustomed food. In certain countries, it results from a bacterial infection that a person may contract. And so in this case, the key element here is to replace fluids as well as electrolytes. Another condition that affects the gastrointestinal system, the digestive system, is something called lactose intolerance. Lactase, that we'll discuss in greater detail later, is what is often referred to as milk sugar. It's a simple carbohydrate. Lactose, is a simple carbohydrate that is digested by lactase. So lactase is an enzyme. It's a protein produced by intestinal cells that breaks down milk and dairy sugar. Lactose is made up of two monosaccharides, glucose and galactose, and 1 cup of milk, which is 227 mLs in Canada, will deliver about 11 grams of lactose, which is this simple sugar. Now, a person that does not produce the protein, the enzyme lactase, by their intestinal cells, lactose will travel to the large intestine undigested. And the bacterial colonies that exist in the large intestine will engage in fermentation, which is the anaerobic breakdown of sugar. The problem with that is it produces excessive gases. It will result in cramping, bloating. It becomes very painful and results in a great deal of discomfort for those afflicted with lactose intolerance. This bacterial fermentation will also have the effect of drawing water into the digestive system. Recall earlier we talked about the very important function of the digestive system of absorption, so moving water from digestive into cardiovascular, but we can also move water from cardiovascular into the digestive system, and that's a common problem in people that consume lactose if they don't produce the enzyme. The treatment here certainly depends on the degree of the condition. The most obvious treatment here is to not consume milk and dairy products or other food products that may contain milk byproducts. So lactose-free milk, non-dairy foods. There's always concern that it could lead to a nutrient deficiency. That's not a serious condition or not a serious concern because of the wide range of different foods available to us. Some people enjoy drinking milk, and so a reasonable substitute for that is almond milk, soy milk, or rice milk. And the Lactaid product can be available in powder or pill form. It's included in certain dairy products if a person wishes to consume that. And the Lactaid product is basically the enzyme that helps to degrade the lactose if it is consumed. Another very serious condition of the digestive system is something called celiac disease. And celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder. And an autoimmune disorder is one in which a person's own immune system attacks healthy tissue. This one is particularly afflicting the digestive system. And this this is caused by the inability of a person to digest gluten. Gluten is a term referring to a general class of plant-based proteins that are found in various products. So wheat, the gluten form of the protein in wheat is gliadin, saccharin in rye, barley, malt, and oats. Oats contain a small amount of prolamin, which are these plant-based gluten proteins. In terms of the affliction rate, 1 in 133 children in the United States have been diagnosed with celiac disease. The reason we quote United States figures because Canadian figures are not available, and these are what are called not at-risk groups. So children that don't have a predisposing characteristic that may suggest that they could develop celiac disease, we're looking at 1 in 133. If a child has a first-degree relative afflicted with celiac disease, the likelihood of that child developing celiac disease goes up considerably from 1 in 133 to 1 in 22. So in terms of what happens here in a person with the inability of breaking up the gluten proteins, these plant-based proteins, is that the digestive system will trigger the immune response, and that those immune cells will damage the intestinal mucosal layer. So the white blood cells will attack healthy tissues. There are two specific genes that, or the mutated forms of these two specific genes, appear in 95% of people afflicted with celiac disease. There are statistical risk factors. It's important to understand these are statistical risk factors, not cause and effect. And so there's some data to suggest that the introduction of gluten at a younger age, a shorter period of time in which a newborn or infant breastfeeds, viral infections during infancy are all seen as risk factors that could potentially lead to celiac disease. It's important to understand these factors are not cause and effect. They're just statistical relationships that appear. In terms of the pathophysiology, the gluten proteins are considered to be toxic. So lymphocytes, which are one type of white blood cells, attack mucosal cells. And the problem with that is that the microvilli height is reduced. And so what we see here, we'll start here on the right. Here we see a microscopic view of healthy microvilli on the surface, making up the surface of the intestinal cells. They're very tall. We have a very significant increase in the surface area of the internal lining of the small intestine. In a person afflicted with celiac disease, we see that the height of the microvilli are cut to less than half, and that significantly reduces the surface area. The problem with this is that it can lead to, or will lead to, long-term, very serious nutritional deficiencies. So with the reduction in height, we see the reduction in surface area. Lactose intolerance is a common problem that often accompanies a person afflicted with celiac disease. So that in terms of the clinical manifestation, a person that consumes that protein will experience diarrhea, abdominal pain, cramping, bloating in the short term. In the long term, because of the signs and symptoms, the short-term signs and symptoms, and the long-term nutritional problems, nutritional deficiencies that can result in fatigue, bone and joint pain, neuropathies, iron deficiency, anemias, and this is just a small list of the clinical manifestations that take place. The gold standard here for diagnosing a person with celiac disease is through a small intestinal biopsy. Initially, from a clinical perspective, a person is examined for the symptoms after gluten has been removed from the diet, but the gold standard is the small intestinal biopsy to get the tissue, put it under a microscope, and to examine if certain antibodies exist that could signal that this person's immune system is targeting healthy tissue. The only known treatment for this is a gluten-free diet. And in less severe cases, microvilli height has been observed to return to normal once a person removes this plant-based protein. Refractory celiac disease is one in which microvilli damage continues after treatment. So this is a more severe case of celiac disease. And this is usually due to the coexistence of other conditions. So irritable bowel syndrome, which can accompany celiac disease in extreme cases, will result in the continued damage of microvilli. There are also unknown gluten contaminations. So the food that we consume does contain byproducts of other foods or nutrients contained in other foods that we may not be aware of. Cross-contamination through the cooking process, breaded meats, fish, vegetables, is a common problem that is often unseen for people afflicted with celiac disease. So this ends part 4 of our Unit 3 lecture on the anatomy and physiology of the digestive system.